I'm Hilary Evans, and I was President of Methodist Women in Britain between July 2019 and August 2021. This video is about a visit I made to the northern section of Mexico in April 2019, visiting towns on the border with the United States of America. When I came into this role, I had been very much aware of human trafficking and hoped to raise awareness about this scourge during my time as President. The Methodist Church of Britain, however, does not have direct links with work going on with trafficking, and so I was sent to visit work that's going on at the northern borders of Mexico with the United States, working with migrants there. So overnight on Easter Monday 2019, I flew with Reverend Felicity Al-Hassan via Mexico City to Monterrey in the northeast section of Mexico. Mexico has always been a hub for people travelling because of its geographical position. Much of the country is quite poor and has many problems of its own, not least cartels who operate in gangs across various parts of the country. Monterrey is an industrial city and a stopping off point for migrants on their way to the border. In this picture you can see Reverend Felicity, Pastor David on her right, and he was our guide throughout our time in northeast Mexico. To the left of Felicity is Ephraim, who is a lawyer working for the Methodist Church in that part of Mexico, and on the extreme left is the manager of one of the first shelters that we visited in Monterrey. This shelter was run by the Catholic Church, supported by the Methodists. It was clean and well run, and here you can see a fairly typical bedroom. There is some government support for the shelters, but the churches do a great deal of the work. They seek to provide legal and psychological help, as well as the practical and physical support. Many of the migrants have experienced trauma on their journeys, and many lack the paperwork required to take them on to the United States. Some of the shelters are just for men, others are for women and children, and some are mixed. But women and children are particularly vulnerable to abuse and rape and violence. Here we can see the outside of one of the shelters. There is a train known as La Bestia, or the Beast, which runs the length of Mexico, 2,000 miles. The Beast comes through central Monterrey, and you can see in the picture that there are no barriers. The traffic and the train vie with each other. Migrants often gather around the train lines, and in Monterrey many migrants were sat around the central part of the town. During the day some try to earn a little money, and if they can earn a few dollars, then they can buy extra things in some of the shelters, like showers and breakfast. In the towns, it's very common to see street traders selling foods. Some are very makeshift and somewhat less than salubrious, but they are very popular amongst the Mexicans. We were driven 6 hours the second day to the northern border, to the town of Piedras Negras. The first shelter that we visited was run by a Korean American lady who had been in Mexico for approximately 8 years. She had gone intending to do work with children and support them, educate them. And so she had bought what had previously been an orphanage. The work that she hoped to do with children hadn't taken off in the way that she had hoped, and so she'd begun to take in some of the migrants. And when we visited, she was catering for around 60 migrants in premises that really were ideally only available to cater for about 30. But it was a very warm, welcoming place. It was run like a big family, and she was delightful, inviting us in, finding it hard to believe that we had travelled from Britain to visit Mexico. And she gathered everybody who was in the place that morning and had an impromptu service. Pastor David was invited to say a few words. And following that, everyone who was there gathered round Felicity and me, put their hands over our heads, and each person prayed individually, which was quite an experience to be sat underneath that tent of hands. It's a good job we weren't claustrophobic. We went on to a very different shelter. A lady pastor felt that she was impelled to do something to support migrants coming through the town, and so she had adapted her small church space and arranged chairs in the worship space so that behind the chairs there could be mattresses. And if you look carefully at the picture, you can see that there are mattresses around the room there. She was really struggling to be able to feed the people that came through her shelter, and so some of the other small local churches were regularly helping to provide food for those people staying there. Many of the churches provide meals for the migrants, taking a turn 2 or 3 days a week to help out other shelters or to take food to places where migrants tend to gather. Others collect clothes and basic requirements to help the migrants as they come through the towns. Many of the church people that we met have been supporting migrants for a long time, and they were very committed. Their faith was strong. They were determined that they would continue to do so for as long as the need was there. Most of them were not wealthy people, but their faith was very strong. In the center of the group here, you can see a young man who came from Angola. He had traveled with his family because they had been persecuted there as a minority group. And so 14 of them, the mother, his wife and children, his siblings, had flown to Brazil and then mainly walked from Brazil to the northern border of Mexico, passing through jungle in part of the route, and losing the mother for a few days. He himself had travelled back and forth several times to help carry the children through the most dangerous parts, and you could see lacerations on his legs as a result of that. But on his journey, he had learnt 3 languages, including English, and he was then working as a translator with the local church people to welcome new arrivals and help them to settle. And the church people there were hoping that he would stay with them and perhaps become a pastor. Here you see a fairly typical street in one of those northern towns. We went on to Nueva Laredo, another border town, and it was here that we had what was our hardest day. As we arrived at the entrance to the shelter you can see in the picture, Pastor David was accosted by a young man who asked for help, saying that he and his pregnant wife and 2-year-old daughter were forced to sleep on the street because there had been a large influx into the town and the shelters were overflowing and could take no more people. It was estimated that there were 20 pregnant women sleeping on the street there. As we went into the shelter, our eyes were hit by a group of tents very closely packed together in the outside space. And we were told that some of these tents were being shared by 2 families. Because the tents were filling most of the outside space, there was very little area where the children could play or where washing could be dried. And so it was a very tense situation with people in very close proximity to one another most of the time. We went inside the shelter, and one of the rooms was full of mattresses, but there was a young woman there who had given birth to a daughter just 5 days before and was just resting, and we were told that 6 babies had been born in that shelter in the previous 2 weeks. Main meals at the shelters are generally provided, and here you can see men and women sharing lunch together. Sometimes the men and the women are separated at meal times, though, to reduce any potential friction which may occur, as often the women are vulnerable and some tension can arise between some of the men. And outside in the space you can see a roof covering has been constructed to give some additional shelter and some shade when it gets pretty hot. On the outskirts of the town of Reynosa, we visited a modern shelter, purpose-built. It included a medical facility run by staff from Médecins Sans Frontières, and so psychological counselling was available, as well as medical help. There were additional tents on the site to accommodate when high numbers of migrants arrive, but there was still plenty of space, somewhere for the children to play, a cafe building and a chapel. But many of the tents had some additional protection over the top, so it was a well-run, well-organised shelter which had a welcome feel to it for those arriving. And we met children having fun, playing with a wheeled truck, pretending it was a train, running up and down the site and giving each other rides. They were having great fun. And the pastor in charge knew everyone there by name and was very happy to play with the children, talk to them and tell them stories. There was even a facility where families could cook their own meals from time to time, taking it in turns. And that must have been such a treat to have that little piece of independence and not have to rely on other people serving everything that you needed. There was even a sports court at the top of the site where people could play football and tennis, and it was doubled as an area to dry their washing. The journey from Nueva Laredo to Reynosa was a memorable experience. As we went into the car in the morning, David and Ephraim said to us, "If we're stopped, say nothing. And if you have to say anything, just say that you are with a church. Don't give any details." And we set off for around a 3-hour journey along a road which was two-way, similar to a country road in this country, but on either side surrounded by dense shrubbery, which the sort of area that could hide a multitude of sins, and we were told later it did. We passed a checkpoint, a military checkpoint, successfully, and just a few miles on there was a further checkpoint with federal police, and they were watching from an armoured truck. And we passed by successfully, but then David and Ephraim were constantly looking in the rearview mirror, whispering to one another. And all of a sudden, David put his foot down and we took off at speed over a winding and undulating road because a white car had been following us, and they knew that these were members of a cartel who would have stopped us if we hadn't escaped from them. David and Ephraim had travelled that road a number of times before and knew the dangers, and told us later of some of the horrible things that have happened when people have been stopped along that route. And there were also stories of Reynosa itself, which the cartels are dominant. Returning to Monterrey, the local bishop came to thank Felicity and I for visiting and told us, "Oh, you do realise that Reynosa is renowned as one of the most dangerous towns in Mexico," which was quite daunting to hear. There is a train which runs the length of Mexico, as I said. Starting in the south, about a third of the way north, it branches to go to several points on the northern border. There are no passenger trains in Mexico, just this goods train. And so many migrants try to hitch a ride by sitting on top of the wagons or low down between the wagons. It's a dangerous occupation. Some fall asleep and fall off, others are pushed. Cartels also ride the trains and try to extort what they can get, and if they don't get what they want, then they push people off as well. And so there are many accidents, and quite literally the Mexican people have to pick up the pieces. Unaccompanied youngsters are often picked up by the cartels en route, and when they reach the border, they are trafficked to various other occupations across Mexico and across the border into the United States. There are no facilities on the trains, so local Mexican people will often throw food up to people riding the trains. Although there are cafes and facilities at points along the route where people can get off and have a rest, have some medical support, and be fed. Even when significant injuries are sustained because someone has fallen under a train wheel, for example, then it is not unusual for people travelling to say, if it's God's will, then it's God's will, and to be very matter of fact about their circumstances. Many of the migrants, though, walk thousands of miles to reach their goal of being able to go into the United States. There are 7 Methodist conferences in Mexico compared to the 1 which we have in Britain. So it's a large country. And we flew across from Monterrey to the northwest tip of where Tijuana sits alongside San Diego of the United States. The 2 towns cover a huge urban area with a wall running between them. In the picture here you can see what is known as La Chaparral, which is the border crossing from San Diego to Tijuana. In the autumn of 2018, Tijuana experienced a huge influx of migrants, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people, largely travelling in one caravan. They could not be accommodated in the existing shelters, and so the local authority took over a large sports facility which housed several thousand for a while. Some of the migrants took over a warehouse, and others put tents up in this area that you can see, which is a large, wide, concreted area. By the time we arrived, all of that had been cleared and the spaces were back to their proper uses. People had been moved to other areas around Tijuana. A few had managed to be taken across the border into the USA. Some decided to settle in the Tijuana area because there are jobs in that area, and some had returned to their homelands. The wall was very evident in the area, marching across the hillsides and very close for much of the way near the main road through Tijuana. We met a group of pastors from the United Methodist Church in the United States who were visiting. Their church had given some money to support some of the facilities to help migrants, and so they were visiting to see how that work was going. And we joined with them on a trip to Mexicali, to the east of Tijuana. The 3-hour drive through the mountains was amazing. The terrain was nothing like I had ever seen before. Much of the way it looked like huge boulders piled up on top of one another, which had been smoothed out by something or other. Was quite a sight, and eventually gave way to desert as one came down towards Mexicali. In downtown Mexicali, we visited a church which sits between two brothels on a not very salubrious street. And opposite, almost opposite, there is a shelter. The members there provide meals for migrants around the town who often congregate in the parks and in areas where they can find rest around the town. And we helped to prepare some large rolls which were to go out that day. One of the ladies there helping was the president of that conference, the equivalent to the role that I had. And we communicated with smiles and sign language, as we didn't share one another's spoken language. Felicity and I then accompanied a group of people taking the food out to the local park. When we arrived, there was nobody in sight, but within a very few minutes, around 50 or 60 men, women and children appeared as if from nowhere and sat quietly on a wall waiting for the food to be distributed. But before the food is distributed, one of the pastors normally gives a word, a short worship time, and the people sat intently in the main, listening hard to what was being said and seeming to appreciate that they were being spoken to in this way. And then the food was distributed along with some drinks. Back at the church, we went across the road to visit the shelter. And as we'd been out delivering the food, a group of 50 or 60 migrants had arrived at the shelter and were waiting patiently to be registered. We were shown around the shelter and met women and children in their dormitory, which was very overcrowded. The lady manager in charge of that shelter was almost in tears as she said to us, "These people have arrived today and I don't know how I'm going to feed them. I've had to close the kitchen because we've run out of food." And one of the American pastors took out some money from his pocket and gave to her so that she would be able to feed those new arrivals that day. At the western tip of Tijuana, there is a lighthouse known as El Faro. The wall marches down into the sea and crosses a circular paved area Half of it is on the American side and half on the Mexican. On Sunday mornings, people gather on both sides of the wall for a short service. Families that are separated by the wall. The wall in that area is mainly slatted vertical metal pieces. But on the American side, sometime previously, they had added another metal fence in a grid pattern with just very small holes in the grid. And where people used to be able to put their arms through the vertical bars to give one another a hug, now they are only able to put their small finger to one of the holes and just touch one another. And it is very difficult to see clearly looking through that grid. So it's very hard on those families. In the picture here you can see on the left side of the picture a man called Guillermo, who runs that service every Sunday morning, but he also works helping unaccompanied youngsters who arrive at the border, rescuing as many as possible from being trafficked and helping to train and educate them so that they can survive in that area as well as possible. After Sunday service on the American side, the people there are cleared away very quickly, but the Mexicans encourage people to stay. They provide music and entertainment for them. They encourage them to spend time on the beach and to have some recreation. They also have people there who are able to counsel them if necessary. And so they are very supportive of the migrants coming through. Close to the border, a new migrant cafe was being finished when we visited. It's known as Juan 6:35 or John 6:35, with the verse from the Bible which begins, "I am the bread of life." With help from the United Methodist Church, they were able to provide catering facilities which were of a high standard and were aiming ultimately to be able to feed up to 400 migrants 3 times a day, both in the cafe and at the nearby park. They planned to begin by supporting women and children because they are the most vulnerable. There are showering and sanitary facilities there so that they can clean themselves and refresh. We heard later that by January 2020 they had begun to offer English and maths classes to some of the migrants to help them to be able to settle when they got to the United States. And they hoped to be able to add a mezzanine floor at some point, so they would be able to offer accommodation to some of the most vulnerable women and children en route. Migrants continue to arrive at the northern border of Mexico. They are driven from their homes by conflict, by aggressive regimes, by a changing climate which prevents their food from growing, and so they are unable to feed themselves. Predominantly the people are coming from those areas of El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras because of climate change. For many of the people there, being in Mexico is challenging, but it is better than the situation that they have come from. And so the vast majority of the migrants that we met were able to look us in the eye and to smile and to give the feeling that they have hope of a better future.